Officer Harlan Voss stood by the cracked dashboard of the beat-up sedan, his smirk widening as he hurled insults at the quiet black woman behind the wheel. He saw the traffic stop as a perfect opportunity to exert his authority over someone he deemed powerless, never suspecting that he was currently berating a decorated United States Air Force colonel. His blatant display of prejudice had just set the stage for the most devastating mistake of his professional career. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of County Road 114, a lonely stretch of highway that skirted the edge of the sprawling Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The heat rose in shimmering waves off the road, distorting the horizon and making the dusty scrub brush look like it was dancing. Inside the faded rust-spotted Honda Accord, Colonel Alara Kane sat in silence, the air conditioning blowing barely cooler than the outside air. She wore a faded gray t-shirt, worn denim jeans, and scuffed sneakers. Her hair was tied back in a simple messy bun. To anyone looking, she was just an ordinary citizen driving an ordinary, barely running car. But Colonel Alara Kane was anything but ordinary. She was one of the most respected tactical strategists in the United States Air Force. She had served multiple tours overseas, commanded operations in hostile territories, and possessed a chest full of medals she kept locked away in a wooden box in her study. Currently, she was the newly appointed base commander for Vandenberg's primary logistics and security division. Part of her new mandate, ordered directly by the Pentagon, was to conduct a comprehensive, unannounced security audit of the base's outer perimeter. There had been reports of lax local law enforcement coordination and potential civilian vulnerabilities. Alara, never one to lead from behind a desk, decided the only way to get a true assessment was to run the perimeter herself, undercover. She wanted to see how the local patrols treated unrecognized civilian vehicles lingering near the military borders. She wanted to test response times. She just didn't expect the first threat she encountered to be wearing a police badge. A few miles behind her, nestled in the shade of a massive billboard, sat Haven Police Department Cruiser 42. Inside was Officer Harlan Voss. Voss was a veteran of the local force, a man whose waistline had expanded along with his ego over the years. He was notorious in the department for his aggressive tactics and a deeply ingrained, barely concealed prejudice that his superiors chose to ignore because of his high-ticket quotas. Voss liked order, and his definition of order was simple. People he didn't like didn't belong in his town. As Alara's beat-up Honda rattled past his hiding spot, Voss lowered his radar gun. She wasn't speeding. She was going exactly the limit. But Voss's eyes narrowed as he watched the car pass. He noted the older model, the slight dent in the rear bumper, and most importantly, the black woman behind the wheel. In his warped worldview, a woman like that driving a car like that on the outskirts of Oakhaven meant only one thing: trouble. Or at the very least, an easy target for a shakedown. "Let's see where you're going in such a hurry," Voss muttered to himself, dropping the cruiser into drive and pulling out onto the highway. Alara noticed the cruiser in her rear-view mirror almost immediately. Her military training made her hyper-aware of her surroundings. She kept her speed steady, her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, completely relaxed. She watched as the cruiser aggressively closed the distance, tailgating her dangerously close. It was a classic intimidation tactic. Alara's expression remained entirely neutral. She had stared down warlords. A bully in a squad car didn't even elevate her heart rate. For miles, Voss rode her bumper, waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to drift over the yellow line or tap her brakes out of nervousness. But Alara drove with the precision of a machine. Frustrated by her flawless driving, Voss decided he didn't need a legitimate reason. He flipped the switch. The sirens wailed and the light bar erupted into a blinding display of red and blue. Alara let out a slow, measured breath. "Let's see how Oakhaven's finest handles this," she thought. She engaged her turn signal, smoothly pulled over onto the dusty shoulder of the road, shifted the car into park, and turned off the engine. She rolled down her window, placing both hands squarely on the top of the steering wheel where they were clearly visible. Voss threw his door open, adjusting his heavy utility belt as he swaggered toward the Honda. He took his time, purposely letting the tension build, placing his hand on his holster in a blatant show of force. When he reached her window, he didn't offer a greeting. He leaned in, peering through his aviator sunglasses, his face twisted into a sneer of absolute contempt. "You lost, lady?" Voss asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "No, officer. I know exactly where I am," Alara replied, her voice calm, even, and authoritative. Voss bristled. He hated that tone. He expected fear. He expected stammering. He didn't expect steady eye contact from someone he considered beneath him. "License, registration, and proof of insurance. Now," he barked, tapping his knuckles hard against her doorframe. Alara didn't flinch. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" "You can ask, and I can tell you that you were swerving." Voss lied smoothly, a rehearsed excuse he used often. "Now give me your papers before I decide to make this a whole lot harder for you." Alara slowly moved her right hand toward the glove compartment, making sure her movements were telegraphed and non-threatening. She retrieved a faded leather wallet and pulled out her civilian driver's license. She purposely bypassed the solid metal Department of Defense identification card tucked behind it. She handed the civilian license to him along with the vehicle's registration. Voss snatched the cards from her hand. He scrutinized the name. "Alara Kane. Address all the way out in Los Angeles. What are you doing in Oakhaven, Alara?" He used her first name deliberately, a psychological tactic meant to demean and establish dominance. "I'm here on business," she replied smoothly. "Business?" Voss let out a sharp, mocking laugh, his eyes sweeping over her faded t-shirt and the messy interior of the old car. "What kind of business? Cleaning houses? Or are you casing the neighborhood? We get a lot of elements coming up from the city looking for easy scores." The racism was barely veiled. It hung in the hot air between them, thick and toxic. Alara's eyes hardened as she took mental notes of his badge number and the nameplate on his chest. "I can assure you, Officer Voss, my business here is completely legitimate," Alara said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the distinct razor-sharp edge of a commanding officer. Voss stepped back, his face flushing red with sudden anger. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his hand resting firmly on the butt of his sidearm. Alara looked at Voss's hand on his weapon. A tactical analysis ran through her mind in milliseconds. The officer was agitated. His adrenaline was spiking and his ego was driving his actions. He was dangerous, not because he was skilled, but because he was reckless and armed. "Officer Voss, I am complying with your request, but I want it on the record that I do not consent to any searches, and I am exiting the vehicle peacefully," Alara stated loudly and clearly. Before stepping out, she reached up and tapped the dash cam she had installed for the audit, ensuring the green recording light was blinking. "Get out!" Voss yelled, stepping back to give her room, unbuckling the retention strap on his holster. Alara opened the door and stepped out into the sweltering heat. She stood with a posture so perfectly straight it seemed unnatural for a civilian. She didn't slouch. She didn't cross her arms protectively. She stood at parade rest, her hands clasped lightly behind her back, her chin parallel to the ground. Voss looked her up and down, clearly disgusted by her lack of intimidation. "Put your hands on the roof of the car," he ordered. "Are you detaining me, officer?" Alara asked. "If so, I'd like to know what specific crime I am suspected of committing." "I told you to put your hands on the car," Voss roared, taking a step forward, his face inches from hers. "You people always want to argue. You always want to make it difficult. You come into my town driving your garbage cars thinking you can talk back to the law. You people." The words echoed in Alara's mind. She had spent years serving her country, fighting for the very freedoms this man was currently abusing. She had lost friends in combat. She had bled in the sand. And here she was, standing on American soil, being treated like a criminal simply because of the color of her skin and the clothes on her back. A cold, calculated fury began to build inside her, but she locked it down behind an impenetrable wall of discipline. She calmly unclasped her hands and placed them flat on the sun-baked roof of the Honda. The metal burned her palms, but she didn't flinch. Voss moved behind her. He didn't do a standard pat-down. He was rough, kicking her feet apart aggressively and running his hands over her pockets with unnecessary force. Finding no weapons, he stepped back, looking frustrated. "Wait right here," Voss ordered. "Don't even twitch." He walked over to the passenger side of the Honda, opened the door, and began rummaging through the interior. He tossed her maps onto the floor, pulled papers out of the glove box, and checked under the seats. "Officer Voss, you do not have a warrant, nor do you have probable cause to search my vehicle," Alara said, projecting her voice over the roof of the car. Voss ignored her, popping the trunk latch from the driver's side. He walked to the rear of the vehicle and lifted the trunk lid. Inside, next to a spare tire, sat a heavy, matte black Pelican case. It was secured with 2 heavy-duty padlocks. It was a military-grade secure transport case containing the preliminary audit documents, radio frequencies, and deployment schedules for the base security forces. Voss's eyes lit up. This was it. This was the justification he needed. To him, a locked black case in the trunk of a beat-up car driven by a black woman from out of town meant only one thing: drugs or stolen cash. "Well, well, well," Voss sneered, pulling the heavy case out and dropping it onto the dusty shoulder of the road with a loud thud. "What do we have here, Alara? You moving product through my county?" Alara turned her head to look at him. "That is private property. It contains sensitive documents related to my work. I strongly advise you not to tamper with it." "Sensitive documents?" Voss burst into laughter. "What? The blueprints for your next burglary? Open it." "No," Alara said simply. Voss stopped laughing. His face hardened into a mask of pure malice. He walked up to her, invading her personal space once again. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here. I am the law in Oakhaven. I say jump, you ask how high. I say open the box, you open the box. Now give me the keys." "I do not have the keys on my person," Alara replied truthfully. The keys were secured in a biometric safe back at her office on the base. The locks were designed to be cut off only upon arrival at the secure facility. "And even if I did, I would not allow you to open it. That case is protected under federal jurisdiction." Voss rolled his eyes, utterly dismissing her. "Federal jurisdiction. That's a good one. I've heard every excuse in the book, lady. You're a long way from Los Angeles, and there are no feds out here to save you." He walked back to his cruiser and retrieved a heavy steel crowbar from his trunk. Alara's eyes narrowed as she watched him march back toward the Pelican case. The situation was escalating beyond a simple traffic violation. Voss was about to compromise classified military materials. "Officer Voss?" Alara's voice rang out, stripping away the quiet civilian persona and replacing it with the booming, authoritative command of a colonel giving an order. "If you attempt to breach that case, you will be violating federal espionage statutes. You are compromising national security. Put the tool down." For a fraction of a second, Voss hesitated. The sheer force and absolute certainty in her voice caught him off guard. It wasn't the panicked screech of a cornered criminal. It was the cold, hard command of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. But his arrogance quickly swallowed his hesitation. "Shut your mouth," he snapped. He jammed the flat end of the crowbar under the hasp of the first padlock. "I'm going to bust this thing open, find the contraband, and lock you up for a very, very long time. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging to go back to whatever slum you crawled out of." Alara knew she had to act, but she needed to play this perfectly. She needed this man to hang himself with his own rope to ensure that not only was he removed from the force, but that the systemic rot that allowed him to thrive was exposed. "I'm going to reach into my front pocket," Alara announced slowly. "I'm going to take out my phone. I'm going to make one phone call. I highly recommend you let me do this before you destroy that lock." Voss paused, the crowbar wedged in the lock. He looked at her, weighing his options. He wanted to see her squirm. He wanted to see who she was going to call to beg for help. "Go ahead," he mocked, waving a hand dismissively. "Call your lawyer. Call your boyfriend. Call whoever you want. Put it on speaker. I want to hear them cry when I tell them you're going to county jail." Alara slowly lowered her hands from the roof of the car. She reached into the front pocket of her jeans and retrieved a heavily encrypted, satellite-enabled smartphone. It looked like a standard civilian device, but its internal hardware was pure military grade. She dialed a 3-digit extension, hit the speakerphone button, and held the phone up. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Command, this is dispatch. Go ahead." Voss snorted, leaning against the trunk of the Honda. "Command? You calling a fake dispatcher? That's cute." Alara ignored him. "Dispatch, this is Eagle 1. I have an active situation at Highway 9 Marker 14 northbound. I am currently being unlawfully detained by an Oak Haven local law enforcement officer. Badge number 742. There was a split second of silence on the line. The tone of the dispatcher immediately shifted from routine to high alert. "Copy that, Eagle 1. Confirming your status. Are you under duress?" "Negative. No physical duress at this time. However, the officer is currently attempting to forcibly breach a Class A secured transport container with a crowbar. I need an immediate MP detachment." And the base commander notified. Voss laughed out loud, genuinely amused. "Base commander? MP detachment? Lady, you are out of your mind. You really think playing soldier is going to scare me?" The voice on the phone crackled again. "Eagle 1, the base commander is currently listed as offline. You are the acting base commander." "I am aware, dispatch," Alara replied coolly. "Connect me to General Quentin Hale at the Pentagon. Emergency override." Wait, Voss interrupted, stepping forward, his amusement fading into annoyance. "Hang up the phone. The show is over. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for resisting and transporting suspected contraband." Alara didn't move. She kept her eyes locked on Voss as the phone clicked and chimed, routing the call through a secure satellite uplink. "Officer Voss," Alara said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "you are standing a short distance from the outer perimeter of Vandenberg Air Force Base. In moments, this stretch of highway is going to be swarming with heavily armed military police. You have made a sequence of catastrophic errors today, but the worst one is assuming that my silence was weakness." Voss unclipped his handcuffs, his face red with rage. "I said turn around. I don't know what kind of prank this is, but you are going in the back of my car right now." He lunged forward, grabbing Alara's left arm, roughly trying to wrench it behind her back. Alara's reflexes, honed by years of close-quarters combat training, took over. She didn't strike him. That would be assaulting an officer regardless of his conduct. But she shifted her weight, planted her feet, and executed a flawless, rigid armbar block. Voss hit her arm as if he had struck a solid oak beam. He stumbled back, shocked by her physical strength and balance. Before he could draw his weapon or escalate to physical violence, a voice boomed from the speakerphone, deep and authoritative enough to rattle the dusty windows of the Honda. "Colonel Kane, this is General Quentin Hale. I was informed you triggered an emergency override. What is your situation, Alara?" Voss froze. The crowbar slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the asphalt. He looked at the phone, then at the black woman standing before him in the faded t-shirt. "Colonel Kane, General," Alara said smoothly, keeping her eyes fixed on Voss's suddenly pale face. "I am currently conducting the perimeter vulnerability audit. I have encountered a significant issue. An Oak Haven police officer has illegally detained me, attempted an illegal search of my vehicle, and is currently trying to break into the secured intelligence lockbox. He has also used racially derogatory language and attempted to use physical force." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and terrifying. When General Hale spoke again, his voice was like ice. "I see, Colonel. Do you require immediate extraction?" "No, General," Alara replied, a small, cold smile finally touching the corners of her mouth. "But I do believe Officer Voss's superior needs to be brought down here immediately. I'd like Captain Preston Langley of the Oak Haven Police Department on site. And General, send the convoy." "The convoy is already rolling, Colonel. ETA is moments. Hale out." The line went dead. Alara slipped the phone back into her pocket. She looked at Voss, who was standing frozen, his mouth slightly open, his hand hovering uselessly over his handcuffs. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the dawning realization of a predator that had just realized it was in the cage with a lion. "Now, Officer Voss," Alara said quietly, stepping forward and invading his personal space, turning his earlier tactic against him. "As you were saying about how things work around here." In the distance, the low, powerful rumble of armored military vehicles began to echo across the desert highway. The low, guttural vibration of heavy diesel engines began to hum through the cracked asphalt, a physical sensation that traveled up through the soles of Officer Harlan Voss's heavy black boots. The desert air, previously thick only with oppressive heat and the shrill sound of cicadas, was suddenly swallowed by the mechanical roar of an approaching force. Voss stood paralyzed by the open trunk of the battered Honda. He looked down at the heavy steel crowbar lying uselessly in the dust, then slowly raised his eyes to the woman standing before him. The faded gray t-shirt and worn denim jeans no longer looked like the attire of an easy target. They looked like a deliberate, carefully chosen uniform of deception. The woman he had patronized, insulted, and attempted to physically manhandle was staring back at him with an expression of absolute, terrifying serenity. "Colonel?" Voss stammered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. His voice, which just moments ago had boomed with arrogant, racist authority, was now a pathetic, reedy squeak. "Look, Miss Colonel, maybe we just got off on the wrong foot here. I was just doing my job. You know how it is out here on the county line. We get a lot of strange traffic. I was just trying to keep the community safe." Colonel Alora Kane did not blink. She did not offer a reassuring nod. She simply watched him sweat. And Voss was sweating profusely. Thick droplets rolled down his forehead, stinging his eyes and soaking the collar of his uniform shirt. The adrenaline that had fueled his ego trip had rapidly metabolized into pure, unfiltered panic. "Your job, Officer Voss, is to uphold the law," Alara said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "Not to invent it when it suits your prejudices, and certainly not to violate federal statutes because you feel your badge grants you immunity from consequence." Before Voss could formulate another desperate excuse, a massive shadow fell over the highway. Cresting the slight incline down the road was a sight that would make any civilian's heart skip a beat. 3 matte black joint-light tactical vehicles and 2 heavily armored Humvees were tearing down the northbound lane in a tight, aggressive diamond formation. They weren't using sirens, but their blindingly bright strobing tactical lights cut aggressively through the hazy afternoon glare. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, ignoring the center dividing lines, claiming the entire width of the road. Voss instinctively took a step back, bumping hard into his own cruiser. He raised a trembling hand to shield his eyes as the convoy bore down on them. The military vehicles didn't just pull over. They executed a flawless tactical box maneuver. The lead JLTV swerved violently onto the shoulder, kicking up a massive cloud of yellow dust as it slammed on its anti-lock brakes, stopping mere inches from the front bumper of Alara's Honda. The 2 Humvees flanked the rear, completely boxing in Voss's police cruiser and effectively barricading the entire stretch of the 2-lane highway. The final JLTV angled horizontally across the road, creating an impenetrable wall of heavy steel and bulletproof glass. The dust had barely begun to settle when the heavy armored doors swung open simultaneously. A dozen heavily armed military police soldiers poured out into the sweltering heat. They moved with lethal, silent efficiency, their combat boots hitting the pavement in perfect unison. Clad in full tactical gear, Kevlar helmets, plate carriers, and standard-issue M4 carbines held in the low-ready position, they established a 360-degree security perimeter in seconds. Voss's hand instinctively dropped toward his holster, a deeply ingrained reflex from years of police work. "Don't even think about it!" a voice barked, sharp as a whip crack. 2 MPs immediately pivoted, raising their rifles and training the laser sights dead center on Voss's chest. The red dots danced steadily on his badge. Voss gasped, throwing both hands up into the air so fast he nearly dislocated his own shoulders. His knees knocked together. His bravado was entirely shattered. He was completely outgunned, outmanned, and outranked. From the passenger side of the lead JLTV, Major Silas Grant stepped out. Grant was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a perfectly squared jaw and eyes that looked like they had been chipped from flint. He marched directly past the trembling local cop, ignoring him entirely, and stopped 2 paces in front of Alara. Major Grant snapped into a rigid, textbook-perfect salute. "Colonel Kane," Grant said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of absolute respect. "The perimeter is secured. Are you injured, Colonel?" Alara returned the salute with a crisp, fluid motion. "I am uninjured, Major. Thank you for the prompt response time, just over 3 minutes. That's a new record for the outer grid. We were already running drills on the eastern flank when General Hale patched your open line through to our comms," Grant replied, relaxing his stance slightly, but keeping his eyes locked on his commander. "We rerouted immediately." Grant finally turned his head, his cold gaze settling on Officer Voss, who was still standing with his hands glued to the sky. "What is the status of the hostile, Colonel?" "Hostile." The word echoed in Voss's ears. He wasn't a fellow officer to these men. He wasn't a brother in blue. He was an active threat to national security. "The officer attempted an illegal search of my vehicle and was in the process of forcibly breaching a Class A secured transport container," Alara stated, gesturing to the Pelican case lying in the dirt, the crowbar still resting ominously beside it. "He also exhibited aggressive physical behavior and employed racially derogatory language during his unlawful detainment." Grant's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched in his cheek. He looked at the crowbar, then back at Voss. "Shall I secure him, Colonel?" "Disarm him," Alara ordered. "But leave the cuffs off for now. I want him to have full use of his hands when he explains himself to his captain." Grant nodded. He gestured to the 2 MPs who had their weapons trained on Voss. They relieved the officer of his sidearm and his communication devices. The soldier stepped forward. Voss didn't dare protest. He stood entirely rigid, tears of humiliation welling in his eyes as the younger, heavily armed soldiers expertly stripped his duty belt. They took his Glock, his spare magazines, his taser, and his radio. They patted him down with a clinical detachment that made him feel entirely powerless. When they stepped back, holding his equipment, Voss felt naked. His entire identity, his entire source of power and intimidation, had been stripped away in a matter of seconds. "Major," Alara said, pointing to the Honda, "secure the transport case in the lead JLTV, and please have one of your men drive my vehicle back to the base motor pool. I believe I will ride back with you." "Yes, Colonel," Grant said. He gave a hand signal, and 2 MPs carefully lifted the heavy Pelican case, treating it with the utmost reverence, and secured it inside the armored transport. Voss watched it go, feeling a sickening wave of nausea wash over him. He had been seconds away from taking a crowbar to classified military intelligence. He suddenly realized that losing his job was the absolute least of his worries. He was staring down the barrel of federal espionage charges. "Colonel Kane, please," Voss begged, his voice cracking. He took a hesitant step forward, but the MPs immediately raised their weapons, freezing him in his tracks. "Please, I have a family. I have a pension. If you press federal charges, I'll lose everything. It was a mistake. I thought you were someone else." "You thought I was someone who couldn't fight back," Alara corrected him, her voice finally dropping its cold detachment, replaced by a fierce, righteous anger. "You thought I was a target. You looked at the color of my skin and the make of my car, and you decided I was beneath the law you swore to uphold. Your badge is supposed to be a shield for the vulnerable, Officer Voss. You turned it into a weapon for your own ego." Before Voss could attempt another pathetic defense, the distant wail of a police siren pierced the heavy desert air. Approaching rapidly from the south, a white Ford Explorer Interceptor with lights flashing was tearing down the highway toward the military blockade. "Ah," Alara said, her eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle. "That would be Captain Preston Langley." "Major Grant, let the captain through the barricade," she continued. "I believe it's time we had a conversation about the Oak Haven Police Department's training protocols." Captain Preston Langley of the Oak Haven Police Department was a man who looked exactly as tired as he felt. Decades on the force, the last 10 as captain, had etched deep lines into his face and turned his hair completely white. He was a man who spent his days drowning in administrative paperwork, budget cuts, and managing the various egos of his patrolmen. He had been sitting in his air-conditioned office, sipping lukewarm coffee, when dispatch informed him that a massive military convoy had just cordoned off a section of Highway 9 and that one of his officers was inside the perimeter. When Langley heard it was Harlan Voss, his stomach immediately dropped. Langley knew Voss was a problem. He had known it for years. Voss had a thick file of civilian complaints, mostly from minorities and lower-income residents, alleging excessive force, racial profiling, and general harassment. But Voss also wrote the most tickets, made the most low-level drug busts, and brought in revenue for the small town. The city council loved him, the union protected him, and Langley, to his own lasting shame, had taken the path of least resistance. He had looked the other way, hoping Voss would either retire or transfer before something catastrophic happened. As Langley pulled his Explorer up to the wall of heavily armored military vehicles, he realized with a crushing sense of dread that his worst nightmare had just come true. The chickens had finally come home to roost. He put the vehicle in park and stepped out into the sweltering heat. The sight before him made his blood run cold. The highway was entirely locked down. A dozen heavily armed military police soldiers stood in disciplined tactical formations. In the center of the perimeter sat Voss's cruiser, dwarfed by the massive JLTVs, and standing near the cruiser was Officer Voss himself, disarmed, sweating profusely, and looking utterly terrified. Langley quickly flashed his badge to the MPs maintaining the perimeter. "I'm Captain Langley, Oak Haven PD. I'm the commanding officer for that patrolman." Major Grant stepped forward, his towering frame blocking Langley's view. "Captain Langley, you are stepping onto a secured federal scene. Keep your hands away from your belt and follow me." Langley swallowed hard and nodded. He followed the major past the imposing vehicles. As he approached the center of the scene, Voss saw him and practically wept with relief. Captain Langley! Thank God!" Voss pleaded, taking a step toward him. "Cap, you gotta help me here. This is a massive misunderstanding. These guys just rolled up on my traffic stop and pulled my weapon." "Shut your mouth, Voss," Langley snapped, his voice sharp and ragged. He didn't even look at his patrolman. His eyes were fixed on the woman standing a few feet away. She wasn't in uniform, but Langley had spent enough time around military personnel to recognize command presence when he saw it. The way she stood perfectly balanced, exuding a quiet, lethal authority that made the armed soldiers around her look like mere extensions of her will. "Captain Preston Langley," Alara said, stepping forward. "I am Colonel Alara Kane, Base Commander, Vandenberg Air Force Base, Logistics and Security Division." Langley felt the remaining blood drain from his face. Base Commander, a full-bird colonel. "Voss, you absolute idiot," he thought, his heart pounding against his ribs. Langley immediately stood up straighter, offering a respectful nod. "Colonel Kane, I apologize for the circumstances of this meeting. Can you please explain to me what has happened here? My dispatch said there was an incident involving one of my officers." "An incident is a rather polite word for it, Captain," Alara replied, her tone even but cutting. "Let me give you the tactical summary. I am currently running an unannounced perimeter vulnerability audit of the base's outer civilian perimeter. Your officer, Mr. Voss, pulled me over without probable cause. He illegally detained me. He subjected me to racially derogatory language, and most egregiously, he attempted to use a crowbar to forcibly breach a federally protected, classified intelligence transport case located in the trunk of my vehicle." Langley closed his eyes for a long, agonizing second. He felt a profound, exhausting headache blooming behind his temples. Attempted breach of a classified military container, federal civil rights violations, illegal detainment of a high-ranking military officer. Voss hadn't just stepped over the line. He had taken a rocket launcher to it. "Colonel?" Langley began, his voice trembling slightly. I cannot express how deeply sorry I am. This is entirely unacceptable. Officer Voss will be severely reprimanded. I will personally oversee his internal affairs investigation. We will handle this in-house immediately." "In-house," Alara repeated, the word dripping with quiet disdain. She took a step closer to the captain. Captain Langley, with all due respect, in-house is precisely what allowed this rot to fester in your department. I ran a preliminary background check on Officer Voss while we were waiting for your arrival. He has numerous formal complaints against him over the past several years. Many cite racial profiling. Others cite excessive force. You didn't handle it in-house, Captain. You ignored it. You enabled it. Langley opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words died in his throat. She was right. He knew she was right, and the crushing guilt of his own inaction settled heavily onto his shoulders. This is no longer a local matter, Alara continued, her voice echoing with finality. This is a federal incident. General Hale at the Pentagon has already been briefed. The Department of Justice is currently being forwarded the dashcam and audio recordings from my vehicle. There will be no internal affairs slap on the wrist. There will be a full federal investigation into this precinct, your command structure, and the systemic civil rights violations occurring on the border of my base. Voss, who had been listening in mounting horror, finally broke. Cap, you can't let them do this. I'm a good cop. I keep the streets clean. You know me, Cap. Langley finally turned to look at Voss. For years, he had seen a gruff, overly aggressive cop who produced results. But right now, standing under the glaring desert sun, surrounded by the consequences of his actions, Langley saw Voss for what he truly was, a cowardly bully who had finally picked a fight he couldn't win. You're done, Voss, Langley said, his voice surprisingly steady, filled with a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. What? Voss gasped, stepping back. You heard me, Langley said, stepping toward him. You are a disgrace to that uniform. You're a liability to this town, and you're a threat to the people you swore to protect. Langley turned back to Alara. Colonel Kane, what do you need from me right now? I want him stripped of his authority, effective immediately, Alara said, her eyes locked onto Voss. Right here on this asphalt. Langley didn't hesitate. He walked over to the shivering officer. Voss, give me your badge. Now. Cap, please, Voss begged, tears finally spilling over his eyelids, leaving streaks in the dust on his face. My pension. My kids. Should have thought about them before you tried to play God on the highway, Langley barked. The badge. Give it to me. With trembling hands, Voss reached up to his chest. He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers numb with shock. Slowly, agonizingly, he unpinned the silver shield from his shirt. The badge he had hidden behind, the piece of metal that had allowed him to inflict his prejudices on the vulnerable for over a decade, felt heavy in his hands. He handed it to Captain Langley, his head hung low in absolute defeat. Langley took the badge and slipped it into his pocket. He looked at Major Grant. He's all yours, Major. I will cooperate fully with the federal investigators when they arrive. Major Grant nodded sharply. He signaled to his MPs. Two soldiers immediately stepped forward, grabbing Voss roughly by the arms and finally snapping a pair of heavy military-grade zip ties around his wrists. Voss didn't fight back. He didn't speak. He simply hung his head, a broken man, as he was marched toward the back of the armored Humvee. Alara watched him go, feeling no triumph, only a cold, lingering sense of duty. She turned back to Captain Langley, who was staring at the ground, looking years older than he had when he arrived. Captain Langley, Alara said softly, preparing to deliver the final blow. There is one more thing we need to discuss regarding the jurisdiction of your remaining officers. Captain Langley looked up, his bloodshot eyes meeting the uncompromising gaze of Colonel Alara Kane. He felt a cold dread settling in his stomach, heavier than the oppressive California heat pressing down on them. Voss was already secured in the back of the military transport, but Langley knew the bleeding was far from over. When a full-bird colonel mentioned jurisdiction, it meant the rules of the game were about to change permanently. Jurisdiction, Colonel? Langley asked, his voice barely more than a dry rasp. My department has always patrolled County Road 114. It's the primary artery into Oak Haven. It is also the primary civilian artery bordering the western flank of Vandenberg Air Force Base, Alara corrected sharply. She gestured to the vast stretch of cracked asphalt. For years, the Pentagon has allowed Oak Haven Police Department to maintain primary traffic authority here as a courtesy, operating under the assumption that your officers were a protective barrier. Today, Officer Voss proved that your department is not a barrier. It is an active, unpredictable liability. Langley swallowed hard. Colonel, I understand your anger. Voss was a rogue element. I'm already losing my badge over this, and he's going to federal prison. But you can't punish the entire town for the actions of one prejudiced cop. I am not punishing anyone, Captain. I am securing my base, Alara replied, her tone shifting from the righteous anger of a victim to the cold, calculated pragmatism of a military strategist. Under the provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act, and with General Hale's direct approval as of moments ago, the Department of Defense is officially annexing a several-mile radius surrounding Vandenberg as a federal security buffer zone. The words hit Langley like a physical blow. He staggered back half a step. The annexation of the highway didn't just mean a loss of territory. It was a financial death sentence for the Oak Haven precinct. County Road 114 was the town's primary speed trap. The revenue generated from citations funded a significant portion of the police department's annual budget. Without it, the precinct would be gutted. "You're taking the highway," Langley whispered, the full realization washing over him. "We won't have the funding to keep the department operational. We'll have to lay off half the force. The county sheriffs will have to absorb the town. Perhaps a department that allows men like Harlan Voss to accrue numerous civil rights complaints without consequence shouldn't be operational," Alara said softly, offering no sympathy. "The military police will assume patrol duties of this corridor, effective immediately. Any Oak Haven cruiser found conducting traffic stops within this grid will be considered trespassing on a federal installation." Langley looked down at his scuffed boots, the fight entirely drained from him. The empire he had complacently managed was crumbling to dust in the span of a single afternoon. He had turned a blind eye to Voss because it was easy, because it kept the town's coffers full. Now that same willful ignorance had summoned the full, unforgiving weight of the United States military. "Major Grant," Alara called out, turning away from the broken captain. The towering MP snapped to attention. "Colonel, is the prisoner secured and is the intelligence transport locked down?" "Yes, Colonel. The hostile is restrained in the rear JLTV under armed guard. The Pelican case has been transferred to the primary command vehicle." "Excellent," Alara said, finally letting a deep breath escape her lungs. The adrenaline of the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. But she couldn't show it. Not yet. "Leave 2 Humvees here to establish the new checkpoint. Secure the perimeter. I want a complete lockdown of this road until the federal investigators arrive to process Captain Langley and his remaining staff." "Understood, Colonel," Grant said, offering a crisp salute. Alara didn't look back at Langley as she walked toward the massive armored JLTV. She climbed into the passenger seat, the heavy door sealing shut behind her with a definitive, airtight hiss. The air conditioning inside the vehicle was freezing, a sharp contrast to the blistering desert heat. She leaned her head back against the ballistic headrest and closed her eyes. Outside, Captain Preston Langley stood alone on the highway, dwarfed by the military machinery, clutching Harlan Voss's discarded silver badge in his sweaty palm. He watched as the lead vehicles of the convoy roared to life, turning around to head back toward the impenetrable gates of Vandenberg. The dust kicked up by their massive tires coated his uniform, a fitting shroud for a career that had just ended in absolute disgrace. Several weeks later, the air conditioning hummed a steady, quiet rhythm inside the base commander's office at Vandenberg. The room was immaculate, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The walls were lined with commendations, framed maps of global conflict zones, and a single pristine American flag standing in the corner. Colonel Alara Kane sat behind her heavy mahogany desk. She was no longer wearing the faded t-shirt and scuffed sneakers. She was dressed in her full service dress uniform, the crisp blue fabric immaculate, the silver eagles of her rank gleaming on her shoulders, and rows of colorful ribbons decorating her chest. She looked every inch the formidable commander she was. Resting on the center of her desk was a thick-bound dossier bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice. There was a sharp knock at the heavy wooden door. "Enter," Alara commanded. Major Silas Grant stepped into the room, snapping a sharp salute before removing his cover and tucking it under his arm. "You requested a briefing on the Oak Haven situation, Colonel." "I did, Silas. Have a seat," Alara said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs opposite her desk. She flipped open the DOJ dossier. "I've been reading through the preliminary findings from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. It seems our traffic stop peeled back a much larger layer of rot than we anticipated." Grant sat, his posture still rigidly perfect. "The text messages, ma'am." "Yes," Alara sighed, her eyes scanning the deeply disturbing transcripts printed on the pages before her. When they confiscated Voss's phone, the forensic technicians uncovered a group chat involving Voss and 3 other senior officers in the Oak Haven department. They called it the hunting blind. Grant's jaw tightened. They were tracking profiles. Worse, they were placing bets, Alara said, her voice laced with quiet disgust. They had a point system based on the race, age, and vehicle type of the civilians they pulled over on County Road 114. Voss was leading the board. He targeted my Honda because an older model car driven by a black woman out of state was considered a jackpot in their twisted little game. He thought he was going to win a cash pot. "Animals," Grant muttered under his breath, a rare break in his absolute professionalism. "What is the status of the indictments?" Alara turned the page. The Department of Justice moved swiftly. The 3 other officers in the chat were arrested on federal civil rights conspiracy charges. Captain Langley was forced into early retirement and is currently under investigation for criminal negligence and obstruction of justice for bearing the previous civilian complaints. And Harlan Voss is currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility. The Espionage Act charges stuck because he used a tool to actively attempt to breach a secure military intelligence container on federal routing. The prosecutors are treating it as an attempted compromise of national security. Combined with the civil rights violations, the assault on a superior officer, and the kidnapping charges for unlawful detainment, his lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea deal. The DOJ countered with a significantly longer sentence. "Yeah," Grant nodded, a grim satisfaction settling over his features. "He picked the wrong car." "He picked the wrong mindset, Major," Alara corrected softly. "He thought the badge made him a predator. He forgot that there are always bigger predators in the jungle, and some of us wear our badges to protect the flock, not terrorize it." Alara stood up from her desk and walked over to the large window overlooking the base. In the distance, she could see the heavy armored patrols rolling along the newly established federal security buffer zone. The highway was safe now. It was monitored by disciplined soldiers who operated under strict rules of engagement, supervised by a chain of command that did not tolerate prejudice or abuse of power. Her unannounced audit had been a complete success, but not in the way the Pentagon had originally intended. She hadn't just tested the physical vulnerabilities of the base's perimeter. She had exposed a profound moral vulnerability in the community, bordering it. "Colonel," Grant said softly, standing up, "the perimeter is secure. The threat has been neutralized. The town is being cleaned up. You did good work out there." Alara looked down at her hands. She remembered the burning heat of the car roof against her palms. She remembered the toxic, suffocating feeling of being targeted, of being reduced to a stereotype by a man with a gun and a superiority complex. It was a feeling millions of people experienced every day, without a satellite phone in their pocket or a military convoy waiting on standby to save them. She turned back to Grant, her expression resolute. "We did our job, Silas. But it's a reminder," Alara said, her voice echoing with the weight of her command. "The uniform we wear, the power we hold, it is a terrifying privilege. We must never, ever forget what it feels like to be on the other side of it." "No, Colonel," Grant agreed. "We never will." Alara nodded, walking back to her desk and placing her hand firmly on the DOJ dossier. "Dismissed, Major. Let's get back to work." As Grant exited the office, Alara looked out the window one last time. The sun was shining brightly over the newly secured highway. The bully had been broken. The corrupt system had been dismantled. And justice, swift and absolute, had finally come to Oak Haven. Wow. Talk about the ultimate dose of instant karma. Officer Voss thought he was playing a sick game for a cash bet, but he ended up gambling away his freedom, his career, and his entire corrupt police department. Colonel Kane proved that true power doesn't need to shout. It just waits for the perfect moment to strike. What did you think of Captain Langley losing his entire jurisdiction to the military? Did he deserve it? Let me know in the comments. If you loved seeing this bully get exactly what he deserved, hit that like button, share this epic story, and subscribe for more incredible real-life drama.